My name is Snyder. I am the founder and CEO of Thistle Technologies. And before starting this company, I had a number of different roles. I was the CISO, or the Chief Security Officer, at companies including Square, Fastly, Mozilla. I was the Chief Software Security Officer at Intel. I owned all the security and privacy features for iOS and OS X while I was at Apple for almost 6 years. I owned security sign-off for the Windows operating system at Microsoft for multiple releases of the Windows operating system. I was a security software engineer, a security researcher, a security consultant. I had a long career in security before I started this company. But in my role at Intel, I got to see an industry scale perspective of the devices space. And what I saw was that a lot of the work that we had done in general purpose operating systems hadn't made its way over to devices. And there are a lot of reasons, maybe good reasons, maybe not so good reasons, for why we haven't seen the same level of investment in the devices space as we have seen in those general purpose operating systems. But the fact is, this is where we are. And for some of these devices, it's actually almost like the 90s. And I picked the 90s because in 1995, we saw the first memory corruption vulnerability exploited, demonstrated in a public way, and that was split VT. And after that is when operating systems started adding memory corruption mitigations in place to make it harder to exploit memory corruption vulnerabilities. They might result from things like a buffer overflow or an integer overflow or use after free sort of vulnerability. But then there was this sort of cat and mouse game for a very long time trying to build these memory corruption mitigations into these operating systems. And so we saw an increase in resilience in these general purpose operating systems like Linux and OpenBSD, in Windows eventually, although they didn't get on board until like 2002, and so on. But for a lot of these devices, this is actually where we're starting. Not all of them. But unfortunately, we take these device OSs, these device systems that have all the complexity today of modern operating systems, and then we put them on the same networks. They're on the internet, they're listening on radio networks, et cetera. So they have a lot of the same exposure. And then we attach them to physical systems that have real-world impact, sometimes often human safety. If we're talking about cars, we're talking about controllers for power and water. So the impact is higher than ever. The exposure is incredible. And for a lot of these systems, they just haven't had a fraction even of the investment that we've seen for modern general-purpose operating systems. And then we start to see that organized crime, other folks are waking up to recognizing that these are really interesting targets. They're really interesting targets. And as a CISO, I'm sitting there with my network full of devices, whether that's the HVAC, whether that's your physical access system, whether that's the Starcom communicator on your conference table, whether that's your printers, you name it. There was just an infinite number of devices in the corporate environment, let alone out in the world. Beyond that, just the scope of the CISO, looking at all those devices and recognizing that they are essentially uninspectable black boxes to the IT organization or to the security organization, but they're not uninspectable to the attacker, because for the attacker, they've got access to debuggers and all the time in the world, just like the developers have, and so they're able to do the sort of analysis that identifies vulnerabilities, and they're able to create exploits for them. So what we start to see is folks demonstrating and taking advantage of these kinds of vulnerabilities. One of my favorites on this list here is this fish tank monitor that was the entry point to a hack that took over an entire casino, right? I don't know any CISO that is spending time analyzing that level of devices there, but also you just can't. You don't have enough time or resources. All those organizations are understaffed compared to the problem that they're up against. But for every one of these organizations, the most painful, most unmanaged, most vulnerable set of systems are the devices. So there are a lot of good reasons, a lot of reasons why we ended up in this state. But this kind of low-level work is hard to get right, really easy to get wrong. When it fails in spectacular ways. And the folks who are equipped to write the code for these low-level security capabilities, they're in high demand and short supply. It's a really specialized skill set. And for having built these teams in a number of these organizations, I'm going to tell you, it's a really specialized skill set. It's hard to find these folks. It's hard to build those teams. It's tough. So I'm not saying that I'm not here to point the finger, right, and say that these folks need to step up. I'm saying it's hard, and I'm not confused about why it's hard. I've been in the trenches for these sorts of things. But in addition to seeing pressure from attackers, different sorts of attackers, we're also seeing regulatory pressure increasing. So this is a fantastic thing. And maybe a lot of you are from the EU, and so we're excited as consumers or excited as people who will feel the impact of these devices being protected by more and more device makers recognizing they have to step up to meet these Cyber Resiliency Act requirements. That's a challenge for us who make devices, but also a benefit for us who live in these worlds with these devices that have otherwise gone underinvested. But it's also interesting for other markets, like in the US market that doesn't have this sort of regulatory requirement. I don't think that the device makers are going to put it in for the European market and then yank it out for a different market, right? So I think we all benefit from the work that has to be done here. But it's not easy. This is not easy work. It can actually be quite a challenge. There are a couple of other things that are happening here. So in addition to the Cyber Resiliency Act, we're also seeing more and more investment in the computation that happens at the edge. So after you spend your millions of dollars or tens of millions of dollars or more to create your model that executes at your device at the edge, to build this incredible product that does something amazing, right? That model needs to be protected at the edge. So there's additional work that needs to happen here. And then the scale of devices that are out there are increasing, not to mention the way they're interoperable and the growing complexity. So this work needs to happen because it's required for regulatory reasons, or just because it's required to protect the business investment, or to protect against the changing threat environment. So there are two ways things can change. And I gave you that long spiel about my career and how I got here at the beginning for a reason. Because in 2002, Microsoft hired me to go work on securing the Windows operating system. So yeah, two ways that things can change in the security industry. That's to say, like, large-scale security investment changes. And so I'd say that Microsoft was experiencing the hard way. When I joined Microsoft in 2002, they were experiencing a tsunami of malware, of viruses, of worms. They were really struggling, and their customers were feeling a lot of pain, and Microsoft was experiencing a lot of anger back from their customers because this was impacting businesses. This was downtime for the retail point of sale systems. This was downtime for online systems. It was incredibly painful. And if you had a large IT deployment of Windows workstations that were infested with malware, that were impacting your business operations, you were also angry as a CISO. So somewhere around the summer of 2003, we experienced Slammer and Blaster, and it reached a boiling point. So I'd say that this is the example of the hard way, which is to say, feeling a lot of pain. That is when security investment changes at a large scale, when someone is feeling a lot of pain, or an industry is feeling a lot of pain. So the industry demonstrated to Microsoft that they were feeling pain, and Microsoft got on board and started doing this work. And so out of that, we saw the first release that I had sign off for, which was the XPSP2 release, first security release, where we implemented a lot of broad-scale mitigations that reduce the overall impact of vulnerabilities, that make it easier to update after vulnerabilities have been identified, so they can be patched, and a security development lifecycle that meant that we were going to be considering security at every step of the development lifecycle, which took time and change. And Microsoft is probably the organization that invests most in security right now. There's probably a couple of organizations that I'm not sure who's at number one, but they have invested a huge amount over the last 20 years to improve the security of their products. That was the hard way. This is the easy way. Easier at any rate. None of these are actually easy, but the easier way is, my favorite example of this is multi-factor authentication. And since I see some gray hair in this room, like mine, which I've leveraged technology to mitigate, there is this experience of RSA tokens. I don't know if you've had this experience where they're these little key fobs usually you have to carry around with you, and they were such a pain that you didn't want to deploy them broadly. You only deployed them on your most sensitive systems, like your production systems, or if it was associated with a bank account, it was a high-value bank account. You didn't use it for everything because it was such a pain to deploy. And you had to carry it with you, and if you lose your fob, right, you're locked out of your system. So it was a management nightmare, and nobody wanted to deploy them, or if you did it for as few systems as possible. It was also crazy expensive. And you get to the point where we were able to leverage phones now, leveraging an app like Duo, to access multi-factor authentication, which made it really easy to deploy. And today, you have multi-factor authentication associated with like your Miles account for your I don't know, your loyalty account for your hotel. You have it associated with your gaming account and all kinds of things that we wouldn't necessarily have previously considered to be a high-value account. And the reason is because it's easy to use, it's easy to deploy, it's easy to manage compared to where we were in the past. And now it's deployed everywhere. Your dentist's office is probably using single sign-on and multi-factor authentication to protect all their apps, all their interaction in their office, and they don't even have an IT person, right? So that is how easy it has become to leverage multi-factor authentication, and now it's everywhere. So what do we do, right? Now we're looking at the devices space where we've got a diversity of operating systems, a huge diversity of hardware, a huge diversity of security requirements and different threats that we're up against. And some of these devices, they could not have higher security requirements when it comes to human safety, medical devices, aeronautics, you name it, right? There's some where the stakes are like couldn't possibly be higher, and some where we're protecting personal information, consumer devices, these kinds of things, which have some health data on them, although it's considered consumer data in most locations. I'm not going to speak for the EU because I'm less familiar about how they treat consumer health data that's generated by these kinds of devices or these kinds of devices. But the fact of the matter is there's a wide set of things. And what I'm seeing over and over again in all these different environments is folks who are doing this work have to do it on their own. They are reinventing the wheel in every different development environment, which is incredibly painful. And as we discussed earlier, the set of folks who are actually equipped to do that work are in high demand, short supply. Additionally, building the capability is different than building it to resilience. So let's say building a capability that encrypts the thing and validates the thing is encrypted. Okay, we built a security feature. It's not the same thing as building a security resilient feature that considers how the attacker is going to undermine that security capability. Where are your keys stored? Where is your source of entropy? What happens? What sort of side channels might be available to the attacker to try and pull key material out of your system? There is a number of considerations that not everybody it's not going to be obvious to every developer. It requires security expertise to build these kinds of things to resilience. So what we do is we leverage what we know from cryptography implementations from the past. Once upon a time, we saw cryptographic implementations being built in lots of different places. But today, we know that you should not roll your own crypto. You should leverage an existing cryptographic implementation built by people who understand cryptography and, more importantly, how cryptographic implementations can fail. Don't go alone. Leverage an existing implementation. And this is actually what we do. We don't build this over and over again in every different environment. We leverage existing high-resilience implementations that are built by folks who understand these low-level security capabilities. And that is what Thistle is about. We're building these. But whether you leverage our implementation or you leverage other capabilities that are out there, recognizing that you can get a lot of security capability in place without having to build it yourself. But trying to figure out what is appropriate for your environment can be an incredibly painful process, which is another place where you can leverage the developer existing developer capabilities. But the same things are from the developer community. The same kinds of things that worked 20, 30 years ago are still the same most effective capabilities today, which is to say removing code that you don't need because it is very often the most fruitful places for vulnerabilities because it's the least inspected, and reducing your overall attack surface. Our colleague who was presenting here a moment ago talked about fewer zippers. Okay, fewer entry points into your system, and the entry points are the ones that are where you do your significant validation, and compartmentalization as much as possible. So for example, doing your cryptographic computation in purpose-built hardware for this, whether that is a hardware security element or an isolated component of the processor. These mechanisms for creating isolation offer a great deal of security resilience, and those are capabilities that are really important to leverage. But secure boot, signed updates, all of these that are rooted in a hardware root of trust are going to give you the software resilience that you need to build devices that are going to be deployed, not for a few years for a lot of these devices. Some of them live for 10, 20 years even out in the field. And the most critical security capability is update, because if you don't have an update mechanism that is reliable enough to justify putting out that update, then even when you know about a security vulnerability, you might not feel enough confidence to deploy that update, because a 1% failure rate in software in general might be tolerable, and we know it's not 1% in terms of update rates, but let's just say it's 1%, right? If you've got 100 million devices deployed, that's a million devices that don't come back up if we're talking about these low-level capabilities. So update has to be highly reliable, has to be a mechanism that you can trust, in order to be able to start to begin to fix these security vulnerabilities. And what does that mean 5 years out? It means that you're able to update even your update mechanism, because you can continue to create that security resilience that evolves into the future to support these devices that are incredibly long-lived. Thank you very much.